Mars has been called the planet of war. Is there something that is buried in our ancient memories which gave it that name? Now there is new evidence being put forward that there really was an ancient civilization on Mars, and also that it was eliminated in a tragic massacre. Research suggests that 2 massive nuclear explosions were utilized to eradicate the civilization on Mars. This is more than mere myth-making and conjecture. A scientist, Dr. John Brandenberg, has come forward with evidence to back up his theory. What is more, he has been encouraged by the Pentagon to discuss his theory and the evidence and put it into the public record. This may be an important breakthrough, which will help to trigger more research and a greater understanding of our true history. Now, Linda Moulton Howe explains.
Well, in 2015, a newly published book by plasma physicist John Brandenberg, PhD, was entitled, quote, "Death on Mars, the Discovery of a Planetary Nuclear Massacre," close quote. And you might say it was his first big pawn move on a chessboard with NASA, the government, and other scientists. And now 63-year-old John Brandenberg, who received his PhD in theoretical plasma physics at the University of California Davis Extension campus at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in Livermore, California, back in 1981, had done his PhD thesis back then about magnetic confinement of plasmas for controlled nuclear fusion. For his book, he analyzed United States 1976 Viking spacecraft data about the Martian atmosphere, as well as 2 Viking images of the so-called face on Mars that stares upward from a Martian highland in the northern hemisphere called Cydonia Mensa. I have a beautiful photograph of this from that original 1976 transmission. And in spite of NASA JPL's insistence that there is nothing to the face except, quote, "a trick of light and shadow," close quote, other scientists have done their own research since the early 1980s and concluded there are eyes, a nose, mouth, teeth, and a horizontally striped headdress that looks very Egyptian. Other scientists who have also studied the face and are convinced it is not natural are Mark Carlotto, PhD of the Analytical Sciences Corporation, electrical engineer Vincent DiPietro, and Gregory Molinar, a computer analyst. They both worked at the Goddard Space Flight Center, and cartographer Errol Torin at the Defense Mapping Agency in Washington, D.C. These scientists have argued that the face and nearby features of a large 5-sided pyramid and other structural geometries are the remnants of intelligent inhabitants long ago, not tricks of light and shadow. John Brandenberg dug deeply into original Viking 1976 atmosphere data that showed the amount of xenon-129 on Mars was 2.5 times more abundant than the xenon-129 to xenon-132 ratio here on Earth, where dozens of atomic and hydrogen bombs had been exploded since July 1945, when America's first tested an atomic bomb at the Trinity site in New Mexico's White Sands Proving Ground and Missile Range. Then, in August 1945, the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that ended World War II. After that, there were many atomic and hydrogen bomb tests on Earth until the 1960s. Originally, as Dr. Brandenberg analyzed the isotope data on Mars, he decided the only professionally acceptable way he could report his findings was to hypothesize that on the red planet there could be maybe a natural process that could have produced radioactive materials during meteorite impact explosions. But he discovered that natural nuclear reaction processes do not produce large amounts of xenon-129 isotopes. And over the past year, Dr. Brandenberg has assembled more data to compare the radioactive isotopes in Earth's and Mars' atmospheres. And in only 2 weeks, John Brandenberg will be presenting his evolving research in a formal paper at the 2016 Space Conference organized by the American Institute of Astronautics and Aeronautics, September 13 to 16, 2016 in Long Beach, California at the Long Beach Convention Center. There's a hot link at earthfiles.com to this important conference. Other speakers will include the head of NASA and former astronauts, as well as managers from large aerospace companies such as Boeing, and a military manager from Air Force Space Command. This is a significant step for John Brandenberg. The more he researched, the more he discovered that NASA's recorded high levels of radioactive xenon-129 and isotopes of krypton are not produced by nuclear reactors. An important goal of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 was to eliminate the release of such radioisotopes in Earth's atmosphere. Further, based on American recorded data of Earth's atmospheric differences before and after July to August 1945, the only explanation for what is observable in the Martian atmosphere and soil would be 2 large hydrogen bombs exploded in the atmosphere over Cydonia Mensa and Galaxius Chaos, date unknown. Recently, I talked with John Brandenberg about the significance of presenting his Martian radiation research at the American Institute of Astronautics and Aeronautics in Long Beach in mid-September. And he joins us now from Madison, Wisconsin.
Well, the fact that the paper got accepted at this conference is quite significant. It means that the scientific community is paying attention to this and has decided that I have raised valid scientific questions, and by saying your paper is accepted means come to our conference and tell us more about this. So I believe there is a shift in opinion in the scientific community that this is an issue which should be talked about, despite the fact that talking about anything involving intelligent activity on Mars was kind of forbidden before. But times have changed. I believe people are now ready to talk about this.
2 blasts in the atmosphere to destroy 2 populations on Mars. This is a big deal.
Oh, yes. The implications are so enormous and dreadful. In 1945, first atomic bombs were set off. There's a big spike of change in xenon-129. It's due to nuclear weapons being set off in the atmosphere. That's what makes xenon-129. The government is very sensitive about this whole xenon-129 business. Even for our own atmosphere, they don't talk about what it means. Xenon-129, for instance, is not produced in any quantity by a normal nuclear reactor. It's got to be a bomb or a reactor that is making plutonium that makes xenon-129. And these are inert gases that don't combine with anything. So they just go up in the atmosphere and they stay there. They don't rain out or combine out or anything like that. The other set of inert gases is a gas called krypton. When materials are irradiated with an intense barrage of neutrons, like in a nuclear weapon, you get a characteristic pattern of krypton isotopes. Now we have found that on Mars. So xenon-129 and krypton are like 2 shoes. The one shoe has dropped. That was the xenon-129. That was graphically apparent. What was harder to find in the literature was krypton, and now that has been found, and it matches Mars. So we have very strong evidence now that something happened on Mars, and the only phenomenon we know that creates these patterns of isotopes is a nuclear weapon. So this krypton is a very important piece of supporting evidence and means that we have a much stronger case than before.
How do you determine that it was 2 blasts?
Because there are 2 radioactive scars on Mars, and another piece of evidence we've now found is that large amounts of a type of glass called trinitite. It was first formed at the Trinity nuclear test site in New Mexico, which was the first atomic bomb to go off. It turned the surface of the desert to greenish glass and then etched it with acid from an acid rain that fell after the nuclear weapon went off. And that has been found on Mars at both sites where the radioactive scars are. One in Acidalia Planitia, which is next to Cydonia Mensa. The other one is a place called Utopia Planitia, and that is next to an archaeological site on Mars called Galaxis Chaos. Trinitite has been found at the sites of the radioactivity.
Can you explain to a general audience what there is about the presence of the krypton, the xenon-129, and the trinitite, that this was a hydrogen bomb over the two areas?
My background is in national defense. I'm a plasma physicist who trained to work on nuclear fusion energy, which was making a controlled kind of hydrogen bomb reaction. And as part of that training, I had to become cognizant of the basics of nuclear weapon design, because a hydrogen bomb is a controlled release of fusion energy. A lot of the physics, especially for laser pellet fusion, is the same as a hydrogen bomb. So I had to learn a great deal about hydrogen bomb design and construction. My background included a lot of discussions with people about nuclear weapons. I was at Lawrence Livermore National Lab when the neutron bomb was invented. So I've drawn upon my background as a graduate student studying for my PhD in plasma physics to do controlled fusion, to do this Mars analysis. All of the physics is familiar to me. The details of why a specific pattern of xenon isotopes or why a pattern of krypton isotopes would be produced, you have to track that down in the scientific literature. The government does not like talking about these things in a very direct way.
But we need to know in a direct way.
Well, there is going to be a discussion of all of this in the public. I believe it's an idea whose time has come. We have to address the fact that we're not alone in the universe.
Right.
And it's very telling that when we found these things, we reported them to the Pentagon first, because we were working for the Department of Defense. So we reported it to the Pentagon. And after 6 months of perhaps internal debates, turned around and said to myself and my colleagues, why don't you publish this? So I interpreted from that they had decided that this had to come out. Even the government knows that secrets have a half-life. They can only be kept so long. And not only that, secrecy, especially in America, is something that should be used only in cases of extreme national security. It shouldn't be used to hide reality from people.
Right.
The U.S. government at its highest level expected to find a dead civilization on Mars. I've talked to people who used to work at Jet Propulsion Lab during the very early Mars exploration, and they spoke of the fact that armed guards appeared at the photo labs as their spacecraft neared Mars, because the management was trying to make sure that no pictures that they hadn't cleared for public release would get out. And the rumors at the Jet Propulsion Lab were the things they were most worried about is finding remains of a dead civilization on Mars, and they did not want that to become public. But they were expecting it, at least as a possibility, and we found it. And now the U.S. government itself has gone back and taken multitudes of new pictures of these sites at Cydonia Mensa and Galaxis Chaos. So they have provided us all the data to make our arguments, and they also released all this nuclear data. So we have evidence on Mars of a big nuclear explosion at 2 sites. And if you look at the map, those sites are directly upwind of Cydonia Mensa and Galaxis Chaos, meaning they were targeted on those areas to dump their load of fallout at the 2 sites. The maximum shock wave goes downwind more forcefully. The U.S. government found it in 1976.
With Viking.
With Viking 40 years ago. They've decided that it is time for this to come out. So it's coming out.
One of the first questions I would want to ask the Pentagon officials who have known about this for a long time: who exploded the hydrogen bombs above Cydonia and Chaos on Mars? Who are they? Why did they do this? And who are the 1 million or 2 million bodies that you speculate may be underground dead in Cydonia and in Chaos because of the hydrogen bomb explosions? Who are they?
We're dealing with complexity. We have 2 hydrogen bombs that went off in midair. They did not leave craters. They left an ocean of molten glass on the surface. Why would somebody blow up their own planet? And if they did, one hydrogen bomb was probably as big as the Empire State Building. The other one about probably half as large. Even lifting these things off the surface of Mars to explode them in midair would have been extremely difficult.
So it's likely that it was some other alien intelligence in war with whoever was on Mars.
It appears that an advanced spacefaring species came to Mars and dropped these 2 weapons from space onto Mars. The weapons were assembled in space, brought to Mars, and dropped. Now, at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to bring up some very sad history on Earth, there were 2 nuclear weapons dropped. They were exploded in midair because that maximizes the air shock wave. If you want to destroy civilian structures, you set off the bombs in midair. If you're targeting a military bunker complex, then you set it off on the ground. But if you want to destroy civilian things, you set it off in midair. And that's what we did at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those bombs left no craters. That's what happened on Mars. So you have an advanced spacefaring species employing massive nuclear weapons in a very ruthless way, and the yield of the weapons was so large, the intention was not only to kill everyone who was living at Cydonia Mensa and the surrounding areas and also at Galaxis Chaos. It was basically to sterilize the planet. It was way overkill. And this means that whoever did this was interested in the complete genocide of Mars. They wanted Mars to be destroyed so that it could never rise again. It would have completely blown the atmosphere off of Mars.
So it would explain the disappearance of all the surface water.
We found what appears to be a global debris pattern stretching all the way around to the far side of the planet, where the shock waves from the explosions ran into each other and deposited a bunch of radioactive debris, what's called the antipode, the opposite side of the planet from the explosion. So this would have completely destroyed Mars' climate. Mars would have been Earth-like before these weapons went off and would look like it does now afterwards.
This is an attack from outer space on Mars.
From outer space, a third party.
And,
wow, what a story.
Well, George, I think it is becoming very serious that this is the truth about Mars, and that this may be the way we are finally going to get into the truth about the history on this planet, this solar system, and in the Milky Way galaxy that William Mills Tompkins and Corey Good and other whistleblowers, Anthony Sanchez's colonel, have talked about a war that involved Mars and Earth and all of this. And so one of the interesting things to me is that there's a new book out, and it is by Chris Hardy, and it is called The Wars of the Anunnaki. And at the bottom of my report on Earth Files, I show it, and the subtitle is Nuclear Self-Destruction in Ancient Sumer. And she goes into the cuneiform and the fact that Trinitite, not only at White Sands Missile Range, where we tested the first atomic bomb, July 16, 1945, is there, green crystal glass. I'm showing it in my Earth Files report tonight. But it has been also found on Earth in places like Libya and India and west of Egypt. And those are all areas that she ties to nuclear destruction, Sodom and Gomorrah-like annihilation caused by warring Anunnaki with themselves as a family and with others, and using technology that, quote, scorched with fire and evil wind